Today I'm continuing to read from the story of classic crime in 100 books by Martin Edwards. The Cask by Freeman Wills Crofts, 1920. Set in 1912, The Cask opens with a major accident at St. Catherine Docks. Dock workers unloading casks that have arrived in London from continental Europe drop one, causing it to split slightly. They discover that it contains gold sovereigns. But more than that, a woman's hand is visible inside. The police are called, but by the time they arrive, the cask has vanished. A mysterious Frenchman has claimed the cask as his own. Aided by good work from a police constable who had read Conan Doyle, Austin Freeman, and other masters of detective fiction, Inspector Burnley of Scotland Yard traces the Frenchman, Felix Leon, together with the cask. Inside the cask is the body of a beautiful woman who has been strangled. This remains a vivid and memorable image, even when described in Croft's sober, functional prose. Who is the woman, and how did she meet her fate? To find the answers, Burnley and his colleagues embark on a lengthy investigation. One suspect possesses an apparently impregnable alibi. The action switches back and forth between England and France as the police struggle to break it. They call on Georges Latouche, the smartest private detective in London, for help. Latouche is half English, half French. He plays a crucial part in unraveling a mystery with a cosmopolitan flavor. The meticulous account of detective work, coupled with the ingenuity of the construction and deconstruction of the alibi, were to become Freeman Wills Crofts' hallmarks, and they set his debut novel apart from the competition. Over the next 20 years, the book sold more than 100,000 copies. Dublin-born Crofts became a crime novelist by accident. A railway engineer, he started writing the book as an escape from boredom during recovery from a long illness. After much revision, it was accepted for publication, and its immediate success prompted him to keep writing. He continued to make use of interesting foreign locations. Inspector Tanner journeys to Portugal in The Ponson Case, 1921, a disappointingly anticlimactic follow-up to The Cask, while the first part of the Groote Park Murder, 1923, is set in South Africa. Travel, whether by road, train, boat, or plane, plays an important part in many of his books, and trickery with the journey times is often crucial to his culprits' cleverly constructed alibis. In his fifth book, he introduced the good-natured but relentless Inspector Joseph French, who became his most famous detective. By the end of the decade, Crofts had earned the admiration of no less an authority than T.S. Eliot, retired from the Belfast and Northern Counties Railway and settled in England to write full-time. Even Raymond Chandler, no fan of his type of story, acknowledged him as the best plodding detail man. Introducing a reprint of The Cask, Crofts modestly admitted the book's shortcomings, thin characterization, and an excess of padding. But it represents a milestone in the evolution of the detective story. The Red House Mystery by A. A. Milne, 1922. A. A. Milne is now so closely associated with Winnie the Pooh and children's fiction that it comes as a surprise to many readers to learn that prior to creating Pooh, Eeyore, Piglet, and their friends, he wrote an immensely popular detective novel, The Red House Mystery. The Red House Mystery is a country house mystery, so deftly written that it achieved widespread acclaim. Mark Ablett, wealthy owner of the eponymous Red House, has been hosting a party of guests when Anthony Gillingham, an affable and well-traveled young man, calls, hoping to catch up with his old friend Bill Beverly. He stumbles upon a locked room mystery. Mark's black sheep brother, Robert, has apparently been shot between the eyes, and Mark, a selfish drunkard, is nowhere to be found. Anthony takes it upon himself to investigate, with Bill acting as his Watson. Milne was well known for his humorous writing in Punch at the time the book was published, and despite the change of direction, his tone is characteristically light-hearted. In the aftermath of a bloody war, whodunit puzzles offered an ideal form of escapism, and Bill finds it hard to think of Mark Ablett as an escaped murderer, a fugitive from justice, when everything was going on just as it did yesterday, and the sun was shining. How could you help feeling that this was not a real tragedy, but merely a jolly kind of detective game that he and Anthony were playing? Despite moving on to books for children, Milne retained his passion for detective stories and wrote a witty and incisive introduction to a new edition of this novel, 4 years after its first publication. He insisted that detective fiction should be written in good English and abhorred the complications that ensue from love interest. He favored amateur detectives and fair play, arguing that detective must have no more special knowledge than the reader. Readers should know what was in the detective's mind and for what reason a Watson figure was invaluable. The sleuth must Watsonize or soliloquize. The one is merely a dialogue form of the other, and for that more readable. Such was the popularity of Winnie the Pooh that it is often forgotten that apart from this novel, Alan Alexander Milne also enjoyed success as a screenwriter and a playwright. His play, The Fourth Wall, 1929, is an example of an inverted mystery, and he also wrote crime short stories, but although the closing lines of The Red House Mystery suggest that Anthony will tackle further cases, Milne never wrote a second detective novel. The chances are that, like E.C. Bentley, he would have struggled to improve upon his enjoyable debut. Chapter 3: The Great Detectives. The decade following the end of the First World War saw the emergence of a new generation of detective novelists. Many were young, sometimes very young. Marjorie Allingham's first novel appeared when she was only 19, but also ambitious and dynamic. They had survived the carnage, but none of them had been left unscathed. Many had lost friends and family members, some had themselves been wounded. With the coming of peace, they were, like the public at large, in the mood for fun and games. Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, Philip MacDonald, and their colleagues wanted to write lively mysteries that tested readers' wits. Their task was to create a post-war incarnation of the great detective, someone who could solve a fiendishly complex puzzle before anyone else. But these detectives and their creators had to jump a hurdle that Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle never faced. Fair play demanded that all the clues should be laid out in the story so that readers had an opportunity to test their own skills in deductive reasoning before the truth was finally revealed. The broader canvas afforded by a novel made this possible. Red herrings abounded as well as clues. The pool of suspects, typically in a closed community, such as guests at a traditional country house party, became larger, presenting more options for mystification. Authors developed increasingly sophisticated techniques of misdirection, none more so than Agatha Christie. Her special gift was the ability to deceive readers time and again without having her detectives rely upon sophisticated scientific or technical expertise or other esoteric knowledge. This set her apart from writers such as R. Austin Freeman, of whom Sayers said, "Thorndike can cheerfully show you all his finds. You will be none the wiser unless you happen to have an intimate acquaintance with the fauna of local ponds, the effect of belladonna on rabbits, the physical and chemical properties of blood, optics, topical diseases, metallurgy, hieroglyphics, and a few other trifles." Sayers thought that modern revolution in the direction of playing fair was a recoil from the Holmes's influence and a turning back to the Moonstone and his contemporaries. But Sergeant Cuff, although a memorable and significant character, did not dominate the Moonstone in the way that great detectives towered over the mysteries in which they appeared. Cuff was much more fallible than relentlessly brilliant Hercule Poirot. Even Philip Trent, whose flawed deductions lay at the heart of the narrative in Trent's last case, soon returned to prove his worth as a sleuth. The question for readers of Golden Age detective stories was whether, if they too were presented with all the clues to a baffling puzzle of who done it or how done it, they might be sharp-witted enough to work out the solution before the great detective revealed all in the closing pages. Sergeant Cuff was above all a professional police officer with a real-life model in Inspector Witcher. The great detectives of the Golden Age were almost invariably amateurs who were fascinated by criminology, such as Lord Peter Wimsey, or professionals who worked alongside the police but were not part of the force. A diverse bunch, they included H.C. Bailey's Reggie Fortune, Christopher Bush's Ludovic Travers, and Maud Silver, created by Patricia Wentworth, a pen name for Dora Emmy Ellis. Miss Silver was a former governess who became a private detective in order to supplement her retirement income and flourished in her unlikely second career, solving mysteries flavored with romance. J. Connington's Sir Clinton Driffield was exceptional, a unique example of a great detective who is also a chief constable, his flair underlined by his elevation to that high office at the tender age of 35. Even he retired to enjoy an interlude as an amateur sleuth, as Connington experimented with a new police detective, Superintendent Ross, before changing his mind and restoring Sir Clinton to his original post in charge of the county force. Writing about professional police officers, as Freeman Wills Crofts demonstrated, required paying at least some attention to procedure and plausibility, even if authors such as Ngaio Marsh allowed their policemen the luxury of an occasional flash of deductive brilliance. Writing about the genre in 1928, Sayers argued that love interest was a potential impediment to the success of a detective novel. But she recognized that times were changing as the detective case ceases to be impenetrable and infallible and becomes a man touched with the feelings of our infirmities, so the rigid technique of the art necessarily expands a little. Her own development as a crime writer reflected this, and she transformed Lord Peter Wimsey from a sleuthing equivalent of Bertie Wooster into a mature and rounded character. She even gave him a love interest in the form of an extensive courtship of Harriet Vane, which reached a successful conclusion in Gaudy Night, 1935. 2 years later, Sayers denied that marriage would be the end of him as a detective. I can see no end to Peter this side of the grave. His affairs are more real to me than my own. But her crystal ball proved cloudy, although she kept writing until her death in 1957. To all intents and purposes, Wimsey's career was already over. Lesser writers struggled to create memorable great detectives. Brian Flynn's long-forgotten Anthony Bathurst made his debut in The Billiard Room Mystery, 1927, set in a country house during cricket week, in which he was critical of some fictional sleuths. This was rather rash, especially given that the American critics Jacques Barzon and Wendell Hurtig Taylor dismissed one of his own later cases, Conspiracy at Angel, 1947, as straight tripe. But Bathurst enjoyed a long career as a private investigator, and some of the mysteries he solved were ingeniously contrived. The concept of the great detective was, however, starting to seem shop-worn even during the Golden Age. Just as E.C. Bentley had meant to do with Trent's last case, and as Anthony Berkeley did in creating the error-prone Roger Sheringham, novelists with a more original turn of mind began to enjoy subverting the notion of the great detective. Their chosen method was often parody, but the most original novel of this kind appeared as late as 1945. This was The Ingenious Mr. Stone by Robert Player. Player gave a near twist to Golden Age conventions. A pleasingly differentiated trio of narrators tell, in leisurely fashion, a story set in part at a girls' school in Torquay, whose head teacher is murdered. The eponymous Lysander Stone, an idiosyncratic private investigator said to be the most suitable man in Europe to investigate the case, does not even make a formal appearance until the second half of the story. A bewildering sequence of strange and suggestive incidents make it impossible for the reader to be quite sure what is going on until the final narrator, the elderly Mr. Bradford, describes the methods used by Lysander Stone in solving the Langdon Miles problem. The diversity of voices adds to the delights of a story packed with plot twists and wit, But despite the fact that Poirot and some of his peers continued to ply their trade long after the Second World War, the greatest days belonged to the past. The ingenious Mr. Stone signalled the end of the era.